December 3rd, 1989. 5-year-old Melissa Brannon walked with her mother toward a Christmas party at the Woodside Apartments. "I want chips, Mommy," she said, slipping from her mother's hand and heading back inside. And that was the last time Tammy Brannon saw her daughter. Melissa vanished from a crowded. How does a child disappear in minutes, surrounded by witnesses? And what does it mean to keep searching when there is no place left to look? Stay with us and tell us where you're listening from. Woodside Apartments sat 20 miles south of Washington, D.C., in the working suburbs of Fairfax County. The complex had been built in the 1970s, a collection of modest two-story buildings housing young families, single parents, and service workers. The kind of place where neighbors knew each other's names, where children played together in the courtyard while parents watched from kitchen windows, where the annual Christmas party was a beloved tradition that brought the whole community together. In 1989, Northern Virginia still felt safe in ways that seem almost quaint today. Parents let their children ride bikes unsupervised. Apartment doors stayed unlocked during the day. Community gatherings happened without security checks or background-screened volunteers. This was the world before cell phones, before security cameras on every doorway, before we taught children about stranger danger as a routine part of growing up. The evening of December 3rd was crisp but not freezing, with temperatures in the low 40s. Darkness had fallen by 5:30 that afternoon, and Christmas lights glowed from windows throughout the complex. The community room sparkled with decorations, folding tables groaned under potluck dishes, and the air smelled of sugar cookies and pine garland. Children ran between clusters of adults, their voices high with excitement about Santa's upcoming visit. Tammy Brannon was a single mother in her late 20s, raising Melissa alone in their two-bedroom apartment after divorcing the girl's father, Michael. She worked hard to provide for her daughter and had made Woodside her home, attending every community event and building friendships with other mothers in the complex. Melissa was her whole world, a bright-eyed kindergartner with blonde hair and an infectious smile, the kind of child who made friends instantly and believed everyone she met was good. That afternoon had unfolded like any Sunday. Tammy had given Melissa a choice between two outfits for the party. Without hesitation, Melissa had grabbed the Big Bird sweater, pulling it over her head before her mother could suggest anything else. It was her favorite, worn so often that Tammy had considered buying a backup. Tammy herself had chosen something special to wear, her treasured rabbit fur coat, soft and warm, one of the few luxury items she owned. She'd received it as a gift years earlier and saved it for occasions when she wanted to feel elegant. A Christmas party with her neighbors seemed like exactly that kind of evening. They'd walk down the hallway together at 5:15, Melissa chattering about whether Santa would bring her the new dollhouse she'd asked for. The community room was already buzzing with activity when they arrived. Melissa had immediately spotted other children and run off to join them, while Tammy had gravitated toward a cluster of mothers she knew, balancing a paper plate of appetizers and catching up on neighborhood news. For the next 2 hours, everything was perfectly, beautifully ordinary. Melissa played with the other kids, running between the snack table and the corner where someone had set up a small Christmas tree. Tammy checked on her, periodically catching glimpses of yellow Big Bird fabric in the crowd, hearing her daughter's laughter mix with the general din of conversation and holiday music. That Tuesday morning started like any other. It would be the last ordinary day they would ever have. By 7 o'clock that evening, some families had begun to leave. The crowd had thinned from 100 to perhaps 60 or 70 people, though the party was still in full swing. Children were getting tired and cranky, their sugar highs giving way to yawns and complaints. Tammy had worked the next morning and decided it was time to take Melissa home. She found her daughter near the refreshment table, face flushed from running around, and took her hand. "Time to go home, honey." They walked together toward the door, Tammy already thinking about getting Melissa bathed and into bed at a reasonable hour. They reached the threshold, 1 foot already in the hallway, when Melissa pulled back. "Wait, Mommy, I want chips." Tammy turned. She could see the chip bowl on a table about 20 feet away, easily visible from where she stood. The door was propped open. Melissa would be in her line of sight the entire time. "Okay, but come right back." She watched Melissa turn and skip back inside, yellow sweater bright against the dimmer lighting of the hallway. A neighbor emerged from an apartment down the hall, and Tammy turned to say goodnight, a conversation that lasted perhaps 30 seconds. When she looked back toward the community room, she couldn't immediately see Melissa at the chip table. Not alarmed yet. The room was still crowded, full of moving bodies. Melissa was probably just blocked from view. Tammy stepped back inside, scanning the room. No yellow sweater near the chips. She walked to the table, looked around. No Melissa. She checked the bathroom empty. She asked a cluster of children, "Have you seen Melissa?" They shrugged, already absorbed in their own games. The first flutter of real concern touched Tammy's chest. She moved faster now, calling her daughter's name, checking corners of the room. Other mothers noticed her growing panic and joined the search. They checked under tables, behind the Christmas tree in the kitchen area. "Melissa, Melissa, where are you?" Someone checked outside. The courtyard was dark and empty, the December night silent. A few men grabbed flashlights and searched the parking lot, calling Melissa's name between cars. By 7:36, Tammy knew with absolute certainty that something was terribly wrong. Melissa wouldn't wander off. She wouldn't go outside alone in the dark. She wouldn't hide from her mother. "Someone call the police. My daughter is missing." The community room erupted into organized chaos. Party attendees spread throughout the complex, knocking on apartment doors, searching laundry rooms and storage areas, checking every possible space where a 5-year-old might have wandered. Voices called Melissa's name into the cold night air. At 7:45, someone dialed 911. By the time the first Fairfax County police cruiser pulled into the parking lot, Melissa had been missing for 15 minutes. By midnight, those minutes would become hours. By morning, investigators would have a suspect. But it would take 35 years for the world to understand that those few minutes between the doorway and the chip bowl had changed everything, and that one man's washing machine held the only proof that Melissa Brannon had ever gotten into his car. The first 2 patrol officers arrived within 10 minutes of the call. They immediately recognized this wasn't a case of a child wandering off or falling asleep in a closet. A 5-year-old doesn't vanish from a supervised party without foul play. Within 30 minutes, backup arrived along with detectives and a search coordinator. The apartment complex manager's office became an impromptu command post. Detectives began the painstaking process of interviewing everyone who'd attended the party. Over 100 potential witnesses needed to give statements about what they'd seen, who they'd noticed anything unusual. By 8:30 that evening, K-9 units arrived with tracking dogs. Officers brought the dogs to Melissa's apartment, let them smell her bedding and clothes, then brought them back to the community room. The dogs picked up her scent immediately, tracking it through the hallway and out to the parking lot. Then abruptly, the trail ended. This single detail told investigators everything they needed to know. Melissa hadn't wandered into the woods. She hadn't gotten lost in the complex. She'd gotten into a vehicle. Ground search teams mobilized anyway, more than 50 police officers and 200 volunteers, spreading through the wooded areas surrounding Woodside Apartments. They moved in grid patterns, with flashlights calling Melissa's name through the darkness. The search continued through the night, desperate voices echoing between trees. The FBI was notified shortly after 9. Potential child abductions trigger federal involvement, and agents were dispatched immediately. Melissa's information was entered into the National Crime Information Center database. Roadblocks went up on surrounding highways, though hours had already passed. If someone had taken her, they'd had time to get far away. What wasn't found told its own story. No footprints leading away from the complex. No torn clothing. No signs of struggle. No blood. No witnesses who'd seen her leave the building. No screams heard by anyone in the crowd. She had simply vanished as completely as if the earth had opened and swallowed her whole. By dawn on December 4th, 300 volunteers had arrived to join the search. Community members, search and rescue teams, and people who'd simply heard the news and wanted to help spread through the woods and fields surrounding Lorton. Helicopters equipped with searchlights swept overhead once daylight broke. Media trucks from Washington, D.C. news stations set up in the parking lot. Tammy Brannon stood before cameras with tears streaming down her face, her voice breaking as she pleaded for information. "Please, if anyone knows anything, if anyone saw anything, please bring my baby home." The image of Melissa from her kindergarten photo appeared on every local news broadcast. A tip line was established. The phones began ringing immediately with reported sightings, theories, and well-meaning but ultimately unhelpful suggestions. But in those first frantic hours, detectives were already following a more focused lead, because as they'd interviewed the party attendees through the night, a pattern had emerged in the witness statements. Multiple people mentioned the same name, describing the same concerning behaviors. Caleb Daniel Hughes, 29 years old, the handyman and groundskeeper for Woodside Apartments. Women at the party reported that Hughes had made crude sexual propositions to them during the evening. He'd asked one if she wanted to see his apartment, made inappropriate comments about another's body, told jokes that made several mothers uncomfortable. He'd been drinking, seemed off somehow, his behavior just wrong enough to be memorable. More troubling were the observations from parents. Several had noticed Hughes paying unusual attention to the children at the party. He'd tried to get kids to sit on his lap. He'd offered to give children rides to get more soda from another room. One parent had seen him following Melissa toward the chip table. At the time, these observations had registered as odd but not alarming. After all, Hughes worked at the complex. He was a familiar figure, someone who had keys to apartments and was trusted to be in residents' homes when they weren't there. The kind of person you'd nod to in passing who'd fix your leaky faucet or replace your broken light fixture. Several teenagers at the party reported seeing Hughes leave in a hurry sometime between 7:30 and 7:35. He'd been sweating despite the December cold, moving quickly toward the door. The timeline made detectives sit up and pay attention. Melissa was last seen at approximately 7:31. Hughes left between 7:32 and 7:35, a window of perhaps 4 minutes during which both of them had disappeared from the party. By 10 o'clock that night, less than 3 hours after Melissa vanished, detectives arrived at Caleb Hughes's apartment. His wife Carol answered the door. When officers explained why they were there and asked to search the apartment, she didn't hesitate. She granted permission immediately. Hughes was home. The washing machine was running. What detectives found inside that washing machine would eventually send Hughes to prison. The entire outfit he'd worn to the party was soaking in soapy water. Jeans, shirt belt, and his shoes. The sides of the soles had been carefully cut off, possibly to remove evidence. A sheath for a large knife was also in the wash, though no knife was found in the apartment. Hughes admitted he'd put the clothes in to wash immediately upon arriving home. He couldn't adequately explain why his shoes were in the machine or why he'd cut the soles. He claimed they'd been muddy. Carol Hughes provided information that made her husband's situation even worse. She told detectives she'd expected him home by 8:30 that evening. He hadn't arrived until well after midnight. When she'd checked their car, a red Honda Civic, the odometer showed extra mileage that couldn't be explained by his usual route home from the complex. Hughes's explanation for the extra miles and late arrival was that he'd driven around after the party stopped to buy a 6-pack of beer, then taken a longer route home. The story had problems. Virginia law prohibited liquor stores from selling beverages after midnight. If Hughes had arrived home around 12:30 as he claimed, where had he purchased beer, and why drive out of his way? Officers requested permission to examine the Honda Civic. Carol gave it without hesitation. The car was seized as evidence that night. Hughes agreed to take a polygraph examination. The results indicated deception when he was asked about his role in Melissa's disappearance. But despite all these red flags, despite the circumstantial evidence mounting against him, Hughes wasn't arrested that night. Without a body, without proof that an offense had occurred, without physical evidence directly linking him to Melissa's disappearance, detectives couldn't yet charge him. They needed more. The red Honda Civic was transported to the FBI Forensic Laboratory in Washington, D.C. Over the following days, technicians began the painstaking process of examining every fiber, every hair, every microscopic particle that might be present in that vehicle. Meanwhile, the search for Melissa continued. By the end of the first week, more than 1,000 volunteers had participated in searching the woods, fields, and waterways around Lorton. Divers went into the Occoquan River. Cadaver dogs swept through forests. Helicopters with heat-sensing equipment flew grid patterns over rural Virginia. Nothing was found. Not a shoe, not a piece of clothing, not a single trace of the little girl who'd wanted potato chips. The media coverage intensified. National news outlets picked up the story. America's Most Wanted featured Melissa's case. Yellow ribbons appeared on trees throughout Fairfax County. A reward fund grew to $50,000. Every day, Tammy appeared on television pleading for information, begging whoever had taken her daughter to bring her home. Tips flooded in. Melissa had been spotted in Maryland. Someone had seen her at a rest stop in North Carolina. A girl matching her description was in a car in West Virginia. Every single lead was investigated. Every single one led nowhere. Our community knows the special terror of a child disappearing from a place that should be safe. We've dropped our children at birthday parties, waved goodbye at school doors, let them run ahead to the playground. We understand that parenting requires calculated trust. Trust in our neighbors, our community spaces, the basic goodness of the people around us. Tammy Brannan made the same calculation every mother makes dozens of times a day. Her child would be safe for 30 seconds while she said goodbye to a friend. She had no way of knowing that among the 100 familiar faces at that Christmas party, one man was waiting for exactly that moment. As December became January and winter turned toward spring, the massive search effort slowly dissolved. Volunteers returned to their lives. News cameras moved on to other stories. Tammy Brannan's daily pleas for information became weekly, then monthly. The case that had consumed Fairfax County was settling into the terrible category of unsolved disappearance. But in a FBI forensics laboratory in Washington, D.C., scientists were looking at something invisible to the naked eye, microscopic fibers from a big bird sweater that would make legal history. The forensic examination of Hughes's Honda Civic began in January of 1990. Technicians used special vacuum equipment and adhesive tape to collect every fiber from the passenger seat and floor mat. Under microscopes, they cataloged what they found: carpet fibers, dust, hair, and numerous yellow acrylic fibers that didn't match anything else in the vehicle. The challenge facing investigators was significant. They had fibers, but they needed something to compare them against. Melissa's big bird sweater was gone, taken by whoever had taken her. Without the actual garment, how could they prove these fibers came from what she'd been wearing? Detectives went back to Tammy. She identified the sweater precisely. Big Bird design, yellow acrylic material purchased from J.C. She even remembered approximately when she'd bought it and which store location. Investigators visited J.C. stores throughout Northern Virginia. After checking with the company's distribution records, they located an identical sweater still in stock. They purchased it and sent it to the FBI lab. The comparison process took weeks. Forensic fiber experts examined the yellow fibers from Hughes's car under high-powered microscopes, noting their diameter, their dye composition, the way they'd been manufactured. Then they examined fibers from the J.C. Big Bird sweater. The match was undeniable. The yellow acrylic fibers found in Caleb Hughes's passenger seat were consistent with the Big Bird sweater Melissa had been wearing. The likelihood of them coming from another source was extremely low. But the forensic team found something else in that car: rare rabbit fur fibers. When compared against samples from Tammy's coat, the one she'd worn to the Christmas party, those fibers matched as well. This finding was crucial. Tammy had never been in Hughes's car. The only way rabbit fur from her coat could have transferred to his vehicle was through Melissa. The child had been wearing or carrying something that had come into contact with her mother's coat, and those fibers had been left behind when she sat in that passenger seat. The forensic evidence told a clear story. Melissa Brannan had been in Caleb Hughes's red Honda Civic. At some point, her coat had been removed, fibers transferring from her sweater directly to the seat fabric. There was no innocent explanation for why a 5-year-old would be in the groundskeeper's car with her coat off. Prosecutors faced a unique legal challenge. In Virginia, bringing charges required either recovering the victim's body or identifying the specific location where the offense occurred. They had neither. Hughes had driven somewhere that night, used those extra miles on his odometer, but where he'd gone remained unknown. Without Melissa's body, without knowing where she'd been taken, how could they prove what had happened? The prosecution team developed an alternative approach. They would charge Hughes with abduction with intent to defile. This offense didn't require proving what had ultimately happened to Melissa. It only required proving that Hughes had taken her with the intention of harming her. The fiber evidence provided scientific proof she'd been in his car. The removal of her coat in that vehicle suggested preparation for assault. Witness testimony established his predatory behavior at the party. His own actions after returning home, the immediate washing of all his clothes, including his shoes, demonstrated consciousness of guilt. In October of 1990, a grand jury heard the evidence. They returned an indictment. Caleb Daniel Hughes was formally charged with abduction with intent to defile. He was arrested and held without bail. Tammy's emotions were complicated. Hope that Melissa was alive had faded with each passing month. Now she faced the probability that her daughter was gone. forever taken by a man she'd seen dozens of times around the apartment complex, someone who'd fixed her sink and replaced her door locks, someone she'd trusted because he was part of their community. Our community understands that sometimes the smallest things tell the biggest truths. A microscopic fiber invisible to the human eye can speak louder than a confession. In 1990, fiber analysis was cutting-edge forensic science. Today, it's standard, but the principle remains. Perpetrators leave traces. They can wash their clothes, cut their shoe soles, lie to investigators and their own wives, but they cannot erase the invisible evidence that clings to fabric, that transfers in a moment, that waits patiently in a laboratory to tell its story. The trial began in March of 1991, 15 months after Melissa vanished. Fairfax County Circuit Court was packed with spectators, media, and community members who'd followed the case from that first terrible night. The prosecution's opening statement was direct. Melissa Brannon was 5 years old. She wanted potato chips. She walked back into a Christmas party and walked into the hands of this man who took her from everything and everyone she knew. We cannot tell you where Melissa is today. We cannot show you her body. But we can show you the fibers from her Big Bird sweater that she left behind in his car. Silent witnesses to what he did. The defense faced an uphill battle. Their opening acknowledged the difficulty. The prosecution has no body, no eyewitness, no confession. They have fibers that could have transferred innocently. They have a grieving community that wants answers. But wanting answers doesn't make my client guilty. Reasonable doubt exists when you cannot prove what actually happened. The first witness was Tammy Brannon. She described Melissa, her bright personality, her obedient nature. She walked the jury through December 3rd, the party, the decision to let Melissa go back for chips. I watched her walk back inside. I never took my eyes off that door. She never came out. She identified the Big Bird sweater from photographs, explaining how much Melissa had loved it. She identified her rabbit fur coat, the one she'd been wearing that evening. Her testimony was emotional, jurors wiping tears from their eyes, but it was also precise and factual. Multiple witnesses testified about Hughes's behavior at the party. Women described his crude comments. Parents explained their observations about his attention to children. Teenagers confirmed seeing him leave hurriedly during the critical time window. Then Carol Hughes took the stand. Her testimony was devastating to her husband's defense. She described his late arrival home, the extra mileage, the clothes in the washing machine. When the prosecutor asked about the shoes, her voice was quiet but clear. I asked him why his shoes were in the washer. He said they were muddy, but the soles were cut. I'd never seen him do that before. She explained his story about buying beer and how it didn't make sense given Virginia's laws about when stores could sell beverages. When asked why she'd cooperated with police, she paused before answering. Because I knew he was lying to me, and a little girl was missing. The forensic fiber expert's testimony was technical but compelling. Using enlarged photographs and microscope slides, the expert explained how fiber analysis works, how fibers can be matched to their source, and what the statistical probability was that the fibers in Hughes's car came from somewhere other than Melissa's sweater. The conclusion was unambiguous. These fibers were consistent with the Big Bird sweater. The rabbit fur matched Tammy's coat. Someone who had been in contact with both items had sat in that passenger seat. The defense attempted to suggest innocent transfer. Perhaps Melissa had touched Hughes's car at some earlier time. The prosecution's rebuttal was simple. What innocent reason would a 5-year-old have to be in the groundskeeper's personal vehicle? He wasn't giving residents rides. She wasn't friends with his family. And why would her coat have been removed? The defense put forward character witnesses, family members who testified that Hughes was a good person, but after the weight of forensic evidence and Carol's testimony, these seemed hollow. After less than a day of deliberation, the jury returned. Guilty of abduction with intent to defile. The courtroom erupted. Tammy sobbed, not with relief, but with the terrible confirmation of what she'd known in her heart for months. Hughes showed no emotion. At sentencing, the judge addressed Hughes directly. You have taken a child from her mother, from her community, from her future. You have refused to tell anyone where Melissa is. You have denied this family even the dignity of laying their daughter to rest. While the law prevents me from charging you with taking her life, this court recognizes what you have done. 50 years. Tammy was given the opportunity to speak. Her voice shook, but her words were clear. You know where my baby is. You know what you did to her. I will never hold her again, never see her grow up, never walk her down the aisle. You took everything from me, and you won't even tell me where she is so I can bring her home. I hope you think about her every day for the rest of your life the way I do." Hughes never responded. He never confessed. He never showed remorse. He was led out of the courtroom to begin serving his sentence, and Melissa's location went with him. The conviction brought some measure of justice, but for Tammy, it brought no peace. She still didn't know where Melissa was. She couldn't plan a funeral. She couldn't visit a grave. She couldn't have closure in any meaningful sense. Investigators believed Hughes had driven into rural Virginia that night, into the wooded areas and farmland south of Lorton. They theorized he'd hidden Melissa's body somewhere along that route, but with hundreds of square miles of possible locations and no specific leads, finding her was nearly impossible. Tammy kept Melissa's bedroom unchanged for years. The Big Bird toys still sat on shelves. Her bed remained made with the same sheets. A kindergarten drawing hung on the wall. The room waited for a child who would never come home. In 1995, 6 years after Melissa vanished, hope flickered briefly. A power company worker inspecting equipment near a lake found red cloth snagged on a branch underwater. He reported it to police, remembering the Brannon case. Divers were deployed. The lake was thoroughly searched. Media trucks returned to Fairfax County running stories about a new lead in the Brannon case. Tammy allowed herself to think that perhaps finally she could bring Melissa home and lay her to rest properly. The red cloth was tested. It was just debris unrelated to Melissa. No body was found. After days of searching, the operation was called off. The disappointment crushed Tammy anew. Every time the phone rang, every time police contacted her, she thought this would be the moment they'd tell her they'd found Melissa, and every time it was nothing. Our community knows that closure is not a moment but a process, and for some, it never fully comes. We talk about closure as if finding a body, getting a conviction, or hearing a confession will end the pain. But Tammy Brannon learned what many families of missing persons know. You can have a guilty verdict and still wake up every morning wondering where your child is. You can know in your head what happened while your heart refuses to accept it. The hardest part isn't the not knowing. It's the knowing without proof, the grieving without a grave. Approximately 8 years after Melissa disappeared around 1997, Tammy remarried. She'd found love again with a man who had 4 children from a previous relationship. She became a stepmother, building a new family while never forgetting the daughter she'd lost. She made one significant decision about her name. She legally took her new husband's surname, Graybill, but she kept Brannon in every public listing. Phone books, directories, anywhere Melissa might look if she were somehow alive and searching for her mother. "If she's out there somewhere, if she ever tries to find me, I want her to be able to find Tammy Brannon," she explained in a later interview. This detail reveals the complicated space Tammy occupied. Intellectually, she accepted that Melissa was likely gone. Emotionally, she couldn't fully let go of the possibility, however remote, that her daughter might still be alive somewhere. She raised her 4 stepchildren, built a good life with her new husband, but Melissa's absence was always present. Holidays were especially difficult. December 3rd every year marked the anniversary. Christmas parties became impossible to attend. Tammy established annual rituals. She visited the Woodside apartments even after moving away, placing flowers near where the community room had been. She joined support groups for families of missing children. She gave occasional interviews on milestone anniversaries, always with the same message: "Tell me where she is." Hughes remained in prison serving his sentence. He never provided information about Melissa's location. He never showed remorse. In parole hearings, he maintained his innocence despite the conviction. As years became decades, technology advanced. DNA databases were created. Unidentified remains found across the country were tested and compared against missing persons profiles. Melissa's DNA profile, taken from baby items Tammy had saved, was entered into every database. No matches came back. Other missing children cases made headlines. When J.C. Dugard was found alive in 2009 after 18 years in captivity, Tammy felt a surge of hope. If J.C. survived that long, could Melissa? When Elizabeth Smart was rescued in 2003 after 9 months, it proved that children could be held for extended periods and recovered. But as more time passed, as Melissa's age climbed from what would have been 16 to 26 to 36, the likelihood of her being alive diminished. The case remained officially open classified as an unsolved homicide by Fairfax County Police. They still accepted tips. But active investigation had ended long ago. Then in August of 2019, 30 years after Melissa vanished, Caleb Hughes was released from prison. He'd served 29 years of his 50-year sentence, earning credit for good behavior. The announcement devastated Tammy. "He never told us where Melissa is. He's walking free and my daughter never will." Community members were alarmed. Parents' groups protested. Local news ran stories about a convicted predator returning to society. Hughes was required to register as a sex offender with lifetime monitoring, but for many this felt insufficient. He moved to an undisclosed location. Life went on. Melissa would have been 35 years old, possibly with a career, maybe a family of her own. Instead, she remained frozen at 5 years old, a kindergartner in a Big Bird sweater who'd wanted potato chips. 5 years after his release, in May of 2024, Caleb Hughes was arrested again. He'd violated the terms of his sex offender registration. Specifically, he'd had contact with someone under 18 years old, a direct violation of his release conditions. The rearrest proved what Tammy and many others had always believed. He hadn't changed. The danger he represented hadn't been reformed away by 3 decades in prison. He was sent back with a new release date of 2039. He'll be in his 70s by then if he lives that long. Tammy's response to the news was measured but firm. "This proves what we always knew. He's a predator. He never felt remorse. My daughter was right to fear him." 35 years after a Christmas party in Lorton, Virginia, Melissa Brannon is still missing. She would be 40 years old now. Her mother is in her 60s, having lived more of her life without Melissa than with her. Our community knows that predators don't reform through time served. They may learn to comply with rules, earn good behavior credits, fool parole boards, but the fundamental brokenness that allows someone to harm a child doesn't heal in a prison cell. 35 years after Melissa Brannon vanished, Caleb Hughes proved this truth. The system that released him believed in rehabilitation. The 5-year-old who never came home from a Christmas party knew better. What did Melissa's case teach us? The legal innovations were significant. Her case became a landmark example of conviction without a body, proving that circumstantial and forensic evidence could achieve justice even in the absence of the most obvious proof. Prosecutors use her case in training programs. Other families of missing persons have found hope in knowing that perpetrators can be held accountable even when they hide their victims so well that they're never recovered. The advancement of fiber analysis as a forensic tool was accelerated by cases like Melissa's. In 1989, the technology was new. Today, it's routine, but the lesson remains relevant. Physical evidence, even microscopic evidence, can speak truth when human witnesses cannot. Carol Hughes's courage deserves recognition. She faced an impossible choice, loyalty to her husband versus duty to truth and justice for a missing child. She chose truth. Her cooperation provided crucial evidence that helped convict Hughes. Many perpetrators escape justice because family members stay silent, whether from fear, misplaced loyalty, or disbelief. Carol's example shows that sometimes the right thing is also the hardest thing. For parents, Melissa's story carries difficult lessons. The warning signs were present that evening. Hughes's crude comments to women revealed a pattern of sexual aggression. His inappropriate attention to children was noticed by multiple parents. But he was a trusted figure, someone with keys to their homes, someone they saw regularly. Position and familiarity created a false sense of security. We must trust our instincts about people even when they hold positions of trust. We must speak up when we notice concerning behavior, even when it feels awkward or like we might be overreacting. We must balance letting our children have freedom with maintaining awareness of who's around them. But we must also be careful not to let fear paralyze us or our children. Melissa's story is tragic, but cases like hers remain statistically rare. The vast majority of Christmas parties, community gatherings, and normal childhood activities happen without incident. The goal is not to live in fear, but to live with awareness. For families of missing persons, Tammy's journey offers a different kind of lesson. Life can continue even when answers don't come. She remarried, raised stepchildren, built a new family while still honoring Melissa's memory. She kept hope alive by maintaining Brannon in public listings while accepting the likely reality that Melissa was gone. There's no right way to grieve, no timeline for moving forward, no requirement to choose between accepting loss and maintaining hope. The case also highlights the importance of immediate response in missing children cases. The Fairfax County Police treated Melissa's disappearance as an abduction from the very first hour. They mobilized resources, instantly interviewed witnesses while memories were fresh, and identified a suspect within hours. This rapid response, while it didn't bring Melissa home, did ensure that evidence was collected and preserved before it could be destroyed. The search efforts demonstrate what communities can accomplish when they come together. 300 volunteers on the first night, 1,000 over the first week. People took time from their jobs and families to search for a little girl they'd never met because she was one of their own, a member of their community who deserved to be found. That spirit of community involvement matters. When children go missing, the first 48 hours are critical. Search parties need volunteers. Tip lines need people to call in observations. Communities need to care enough to look to remember to speak up when they notice something unusual. Melissa Brannon's case has been featured on multiple television programs, in forensic training courses, in discussions about legal standards for prosecution. Her name has become associated with the possibility of justice, even in the most difficult circumstances. But behind all the legal precedent, the forensic innovation, and the procedural lessons, there's a simpler truth. A little girl in a yellow Big Bird sweater asked for potato chips and never came home. Her mother has lived with that moment for 35 years. Rewinding it in her mind, wondering if different choices would have changed the outcome, knowing intellectually that she made reasonable decisions while emotionally never quite forgiving herself. Where is Melissa Brannon? Theories have circulated for decades. The wooded areas near Lorton, the bottom of the Occoquan River, farmland in rural Virginia, perhaps now built over with housing developments or shopping centers. Somewhere along the route Hughes drove that night, using those extra miles that showed on his odometer, is a place only he knows. Will we ever find her? Hughes is 64 years old now, back in prison with a release date that would make him 79. Some perpetrators confess late in life, seeking some form of redemption or simply wanting to unburden themselves. Most don't. The secret often goes to the grave. Advances in search technology, ground-penetrating radar, and other tools occasionally lead to discoveries of remains decades after disappearances. But 35 years changes landscapes. Buildings go up, roads are built, rivers shift their courses. Even if someone knew generally where to look, finding specific evidence after this long would require extraordinary luck. Tammy has said in interviews that she's accepted she may never know exactly where Melissa is. She's made peace as much as anyone can with the uncertainty. Her goal now is to bring Melissa home before her own time comes to finally lay her daughter to rest properly. But she's realistic about the odds. The impact of Melissa's case extends beyond forensics and legal procedure. It influenced how apartment complexes conduct background checks on employees. It contributed to conversations about child safety at community events. It reminded people that danger doesn't always come from strangers in dark alleys. Sometimes it comes from familiar faces, from trusted community members, from people with keys to our homes. The case also kept the issue of missing children in public consciousness during the early 1990s, a time when awareness was growing but resources were still limited. The fiber evidence and legal complexities made it newsworthy, which in turn educated the public about how these investigations work and why immediate reporting matters. For other families facing similar tragedies, Melissa's case offers both hope and hard truth. Hope that perpetrators can be held accountable even without bodies. Hope that science can provide answers when human witnesses cannot. Hope that justice is possible even in the most difficult circumstances. But also the hard truth that conviction doesn't equal closure, that guilty verdicts don't bring children home, that some questions may never be answered, some graves may never be marked, some losses may never be fully resolved. 35 years ago, a 5-year-old girl in a Big Bird sweater asked for potato chips and walked back into a Christmas party. She never came out. Her mother said yes to 30 seconds of freedom and has lived with that moment ever since. Melissa Brannon has been missing longer than she was alive. Her body has never been found. Her case remains unsolved in the sense that her location is unknown, but the fibers from her sweater spoke when she could not, and sent the man responsible to prison. The case reminds us that justice isn't always neat or complete. Sometimes it's partial, imperfect, achieved through microscopic evidence and legal technicalities. Sometimes the best we can offer families is accountability without answers, conviction without closure. But even imperfect justice matters. Even partial answers are better than none. Even when the ending isn't Hollywood perfect, when the victim doesn't come home and the family doesn't get their fairy tale reunion, holding perpetrators accountable still serves a purpose. It says that society values children, that taking a child has consequences, that we will search, investigate, and prosecute even when the odds seem impossible. It says that 5-year-old girls who like Big Bird sweaters and potato chips matter, that their lives have value, that when they're taken from us, we don't simply accept it and move on. We fight for justice with whatever tools we have, whether that's 300 volunteers searching through the night or forensic scientists examining microscopic fibers under laboratory lights. Melissa Brannan's story doesn't have a happy ending, but it has meaning. In the persistence of her mother who kept searching long after others gave up, in the cooperation of a wife who chose truth over loyalty, in the dedication of investigators who built a case fiber by microscopic fiber, in the precedent that helps other prosecutors seek justice for other missing children. If you take one thing from Melissa's story, let it be this: never stop looking. Families of missing persons need our support not just in the first frantic days, but in the long years that follow. Search efforts matter. Tips matter. Keeping cases in public awareness matters. Technology continues advancing. Cases that seemed unsolvable decades ago are being resolved today through DNA analysis, genealogical databases, and other tools that didn't exist in 1989. Melissa's case remains open. Someone somewhere might remember something, might know something, might come forward with information that finally brings her home. And for those of us raising children, Melissa's story reminds us to trust our instincts, to speak up when something feels wrong, to balance freedom with awareness. Not to live in fear, but to live with our eyes open, because somewhere a mother still keeps the name Brannan in the phone book just in case. After 35 years, she still holds on to hope, thin as a microscopic fiber. And that hope, persistent against all odds and all reason, is its own form of courage. If Melissa's story reminded you that hope persists even in the darkest circumstances, that truth can emerge from the smallest evidence, and that communities have the power to demand justice, then you're exactly the kind of person we create these stories for. We share true cases not for entertainment, but to honor victims, educate viewers, and remind ourselves that every missing person deserves to be remembered. Join our community by subscribing to the channel. Your presence here matters because it keeps these stories alive. And consider sharing this video with someone who values truth and justice, because the more people who know Melissa's name, the more chance that someone somewhere might remember something that could finally bring her home. Thank you for listening with respect and compassion.